Welcome to the new sound of online radio. Welcome to the sound of Universal Broadcasting Network. 'Cause you make me feel like I've been locked out of heaven. A mix of today's hits and hard-to-find favorites, combined with the most entertaining and intriguing talk anywhere. This is your sound. This is the sound of Universal Broadcasting Network at uenradio.com.
Stay that way if you're still looking like that.
Hello, and welcome to the Larry Yates Is This show. We are so happy to have you from East and West Coast, North and South, and around the world. We welcome you to today's show. I send greetings from Larry Yates, who's still traveling. This is your host today, Rev.Carolyn Wilkins, and it is my pleasure and honor to be in the seat and the footsteps of the fabulous Larry Yates. So we'll do a shout out to him as we begin and continue the series called How Did We Get Here? You know, we've had feedback from so many of you around the country that looking at how did we get here has really been quite beneficial. We've talked about health, we talked about race, we've talked about homosexuality, we've talked about all sorts of topics that are not normally addressed. And today we're going to address a topic called morality. Morality, or perhaps the lack thereof. But many of us grew up having a moral code, hearing that you must have a sense of what you are doing, ethics, integrity, morality, humanity. Those are all words that went together. But somehow in these last few years, there's been an obliteration of these concepts. And the last time I talked about respect. And morality and respect have a lot to do with each other. But we're going to look at this from a whole nother angle. Today, we're going to look at morality, and we're going to focus on a organizational campaign started by the Poor People's Campaign with Dr. William Barber out of North Carolina. And they have done an amazing job of galvanizing thousands of people across the country. And beginning on Mother's Day of this year, 2018, they began 40 days of moral action for the Poor People's Campaign. And I'm going to take a moment during this broadcast and share with you why they're doing it, the areas that are issues that need to be addressed, and how you can participate. So we're going to start. In fact, I know a lot of you have talked about being frustrated with what's going on in politics, and I encourage you to listen with new ears today, because what you'll see is an opportunity for you to take action. In fact, if you have wanted to take action, now's the time. So the first thing I'd like to look at are the reasons for the Poor People's Campaign. And they created this campaign after years, actually, of coming together in groups around the country. And they talked to almost 20,000 people during that time. And what they came up with was the fact that we are rooted in a moral analysis based on our deepest religious and constitutional values that demand justice for all. So when you just go to that space of justice for all, it helps you understand what the challenge is. And they came to the conclusion that a moral revival is necessary to save the heart and soul of our democracy. It's not only needed, but it is imperative to save the heart and soul of our democracy. So I'm focused today on the United States. And as we look at some of the ideas behind the Poor People's Campaign, I hope you gain a sense of what is important and what you can stand up for. So one of the premises behind the Poor People's Campaign is that everybody has the right to live. And given the abundance that exists in this country and the fundamental dignity inherent in all humanity, every person in the United States has the right to housing, education, health care, welfare, decent and dignified jobs, and the right to organize for the realization of these rights. So a statement that comes from them is, we must stop the violence that refuses to see these injustices and acknowledge the human and economic costs of inequality. As you look at TV, as you hear the political pundits, messages from the White House, they all seem to be against some of these rights in these areas. In fact, there was conversation this week about the football league and what the owners are saying in regard to kneeling for the national anthem. But what this is the opportunity to express your rights, the opportunity to express what is part of this system is the freedom to speak, the freedom to come together, the freedom to express these rights. So that's just right in our face, where we have a system now who's questioning just our gathering, campaigns, marches. They have not spoken about the import of the Women's March. They have dismissed some of the other campaigns that have come together. But the Poor People's Campaign is highlighting the fact that we must acknowledge the human and economic costs of inequality and to honor the injustices that have gone before us. So as we look at what are the things that are coming forth with the Poor People's Campaign, there are actually 5 pillars that people are being asked to look at. The first is systemic racism. I'll talk a little bit more about each of these as we go through the program, but just think about how there are issues of racism in this country and how during the last couple of years, while Trump has been in the White House, there has been an ongoing opportunity to be negative and not honor the humanity of people. The second area is poverty. There's some statistics around the way we're living today that I think you're going to be surprised at. The third is the war economy and militarism. So much of our budget goes to support a war economy when we're living at peace. It makes you wonder. Ecological devastation. While I know that many people do not believe in climate change, especially those who are right now in a leadership position, there are changes and devastation to our ecology. And then the last is what our focus is today, which is distorted morality. How we are sharing conversations and the platform in giving people a sense of walking toward injustice rather than walking toward justice. So, the first area we're going to look at is systemic racism. And in the area of systemic racism, they're actually the the invitation is to treat all people and communities with the dignity and respect due to all human beings. And in the world that we live in today in the U.S., there are 4 different areas that are being affected, not only everyday racism that people of color are dealing with, but there are voter suppression laws. You may not be aware of this, but over 23 states have made changes in how to register for voting. They've made it more difficult to vote. They've made hours shorter for people to register. And they've made, in some places, in North Carolina, there was an instance of a woman who wrote a note. She's 102, and she's been voting consistently. And she said they were trying to take her voting rights away from her. I believe that some of the states are putting age limits on voting rather than encouraging everyone to vote who has the opportunity and has a breath. A second thing is around Medicaid benefits. Quite a few states, I believe there are 13 states, have actually refused to sign up for the health care benefits that come with what is considered Obamacare because they are not wanting to follow anything that Obama had put out. But as a result of these 13 states not supporting general health care in their states, there are a lot of people who are poor who are not receiving adequate health care. This word disenfranchised is referring to several million people who are in jail because of felonies. And I know that most of you realize that if you are in jail and you've had a record and you come out, even if you've served your time and done what the courts have asked you to do, you're no longer allowed to vote. So that's an area that we want to look at because our legal system says we have a punitive damages with people. They have to come to court. They have to pay retribution. They have to go to jail. And then their record should be able to be cleared for them to vote. And then a fourth area that is submerged within this idea of systemic racism is the anti-immigrant backlash. And that includes areas that include the Islamophobia. We have hatred against people of color, hatred of Jews, hatred of people of Muslim background. And there's a connotation associated with immigrant from the current administration that implies that people who don't come from European backgrounds are criminals, they should not come, and they need to be questioned on why they're here. They have to have something specific to offer. All of that is part of the areas of systemic racism. And again, what we want to accomplish and what the Poor People's Campaign is pushing for is to treat all people with dignity and respect. Take the time, though, to look at this information, and you'll see that in addition, there are issues with First Nations, Native Americans, Alaskan Natives, needing the right for their political and cultural institutions, their lands and resources. Recent changes in policy have taken some of those rights away. And as you know, with Standing Rock that happened 2 years ago, some of the oil pipelines are going through native land and impacting the possibility of water. So the three things that we're looking at is that we have the right to vote and the right for accountable political representation. In addition, we'd like to be sure that immigrants of all backgrounds have the right to citizenship that afford them the full right to vote and participate in our democracy. And I encourage everyone to do it the right way. Sneaking in, trying to get by is not necessarily the most appropriate way, although we know people are coming for asylum and other reasons. But we do have a system, and the system should be followed. So systemic racism is one of the major pillars. The second area is poverty and inequality, highlighting areas where the haves and the have-nots are getting further and further apart. The demand here is equal protection under the law for all people, and that people have the right to move freely without the fear of intimidation, detention, deportation, or death by public institutions charged with our safety. Now, it's written here in a very neutral manner. It's referring, however, I believe you're probably aware of the institutions that they're referring to. But it's more than just the police department, because we have access to National Guard. There are troops that come in, military troops that sometimes come into programs and campaigns. But mostly it is the different organizations associated with safety and law enforcement in this country. Every day, unfortunately, we often see someone of color detained. Most recently, there was I believe it's a basketball player who was making himself available because they were talking to him about a traffic ticket, but wound up treating him in a very disrespectful way. The good news is it was being filmed, and it was very clear that what he was doing was nothing. He was following their orders, their directives. He was polite. He listened to what they asked him to do, and yet he was still detained and treated in a very inappropriate way. Now, what is interesting to me is friends of mine who have a different experience in the world are really quite amazed at what they're seeing happen in today's world. And while many of us that have been brown most of our lives have said this is not new, it's been something that we've dealt with that has been hidden, not in the front pages of the news. What comes into the front pages of the news is any criminalization of someone who may have robbed somebody, or where there may have been a accident or robbery or something, a rape, and people are put in living color on the front pages of news, often called animals and degrading remarks. But what I'm talking about is racism that happens on a continuous basis, and a sense of inequality, of not being able to walk into a store without being followed, having people question you when you go into a Starbucks, for example. I've been in Starbucks in many affluent areas as well as those which aren't. And in so many places that I've gone around this country, everyone seems to be welcome. And there are people there. I sometimes wonder how Starbucks is able to do what they do because sometimes people come and sit all day. They may buy one cup of coffee, and sometimes you don't even see the cup of coffee. And they may be there hours and hours. But it's clear to me that in different neighborhoods, there are different criteria of who is asked to leave if they have not purchased a cup of Starbucks coffee. That is being looked at. I don't want to harp just on Starbucks, but it's just been in the news recently. And there are other places that we go. You get to see what's in the news. I get to live, as well as so many of my brothers and sisters, get to live it every day. Now, if you look at me, I really am a very friendly person. I always have a smile on my face. Sometimes I may be preoccupied with something I'm getting ready to do, but I don't think you see a sense of anger, or do I look like anyone who's about to hurt you? I don't have that look, feel, or vibration. Yet I've gone into some major stores that I won't mention the names, and people have followed me. I am amazed. I have worked all of my life from the age of 16. I've had jobs, and I've never stolen anything. But it's fascinating how someone who is educated, decently dressed, is being treated in a certain way. And I'm not saying I shouldn't because I am. No one should. So it doesn't matter what you have on, you should be treated with some respect. I'm going to move to the other topic, the other area that we're looking at, which is called ecological devastation. The conversation here is we have a fundamental right to clean water, air, and a healthy environment. And we have the right to public resources to monitor, penalize, and reverse the polluting impacts of fossil fuel industries. Now, that sounds like there should be no issue in having that conversation. But the issue is that clean water is not what is the norm these days. Many of you are aware of some of the challenges that they've had with water in Ohio, in Maryland, all over the country. In California, people have held up glasses of water that were brown. Now, that is not what I anticipate getting from my tap. I expect clean, clear water from my tap. But people are experiencing discolored water. We have no idea what impurities are in the water, and they're supposed to be filtered and going through some sort of chemicalization process that takes out things that are dangerous to us. There's also news most recently that many of us are buying bottled water. Now, you think there would be some safety in buying bottled water, but because there's not regulation with some of the bottled water plants, the filters aren't being cleaned. Everything is not A1 from a standpoint of how the bottles are cleaned and recycled, how the water comes through, what purification systems they're using, and the source of their water. So we may be buying bad water that we're paying for. It's very interesting, but there is a conversation in Congress most recently that is asking that they look at regulation with some of these bottling plants. And many of the bottling plants, by the way, are owned by the people that make our drinks, our soft drinks. because I'm sure you know water is a major portion of making any soft drink, whether it's Coca-Cola or orange frizz or whatever you're drinking. But safe and palatable water is really important. Safe air. We live in an environment that, depending on where you live, you can look up and either see clean air, blue skies, and clouds, or you see pollution. Many of the states have done a great job of minimizing the pollution that comes from auto makers and from the gas emissions. So the emission laws have been very powerful in helping to minimize the pollution in areas. We live in the Los Angeles area, and I can actually say that there's a huge difference over the last 20, 25 years of the amount of emissions that are coming. So instead of clouds of dark air, it's a lot clearer. But what I know is that there are more and more cars every day, and we must be concerned about the quality of air. Our young people are suffering more and more with asthma, with respiratory disease, and they're not quite sure what is causing it, but pollution seems to be a part of it. The Poor People's Campaign is saying that we need to have another conversation. And I want to bring in this idea of morality. The reason that morality overrides all of these is that if we were coming from a sense of morality, that everyone deserves air, clean water, and we looked at it from that standpoint, some of these things wouldn't be happening. We would be holding high the fact that our children need clean air and clean water. So that's why there's a national call for national morality to come back to what we consider the basics. And the next idea I want to talk about is the war and militarism. There's a lot we can say regarding war. But a lot of the war is war on the poor, a poor people, home as well as abroad. And the war economy has created benefit to a small number of people, many of whom are invested in making some of the war materials, in making the guns, in making the airplanes, in creating the craft that our military uses, in making the tanks that they use, the missiles that are being used. There are very high prices paid for ships and airplanes and other things that our military requires to stay in the business of peacekeeping. But there are a lot of things that are being purchased that are being set aside for the sake of our safety, we're told, while people are hungry. So again, from a standpoint of our own morality, what are we measuring? What are we trying to do? What is the call? And why are we acting from a place of perpetual war? We're going to have a brief break in a moment. And after that, we're going to have a continuing conversation about morality, the Poor People's Campaign, and how you can make a difference. We'll see you in a few minutes.
Like a fire of transformation.
This is our praying out song, Mark. You like this song?
Through my core.
Mark, you like that?
Shining in the darkness, I can see the light ablaze, and this new territory It's my strength, it is my way. Said this new territory is my strength, and now I pray. Well, I pray that you see the best of life, the best of love, the very best of it. Yes, I pray that you see the best of life, the best of love, the very best of everything. Wake up and see the best of life, yes, the best of love, the very best of everything. Wake up and see the best of life, the best of love, the very best of everything. Say yes, see the best of life, the best of love, the very best of see the best of life, the best of
Welcome to the new sound of online radio. Welcome to the sound of Universal Broadcasting Network.
Cause you make me feel like I've been locked out of heaven.
A mix of today's hits and hard-to-find favorites, combined with the most entertaining and intriguing talk anywhere. This is your sound. This is the sound of Universal Broadcasting Network at UENradio.com.
Hello, 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 and welcome back to the Larry Yates Is This Show. Again, sending greetings from Larry and shout out to him as he travels. This is Rev.Carolyn Wilkins, standing in for the mighty Larry Yates. We're taking a walk today with the Poor People's Campaign. The Poor People's Campaign is one that is galvanizing people all over this country and asking for a national call for moral revival. What they have done has been really amazing. We just finished talking about the 5 pillars of the Poor People's Campaign. And the pillars include systemic racism, poverty, the war economy and militarism, ecological devastation, and distorted morality. Now, I'm not here to just give bad news, because that's not the purpose of this program is. The purpose of the program is to inform, educate, encourage, and to inspire. So what I hope we're able to do is have you think, how did we get here? How did we get to a place that we're not paying attention from a standpoint of morality to how our children are eating, to the levels of homelessness in this country? How have we gotten to a place where some people aren't able to eat because food stamps aren't available? I haven't gone into all the detail and the background, but I'm sure if you look at the poorpeoplescampaign.org, and you'll find information about the campaign in general, you'll also find information about what's going on in your state. So if you look at homelessness, for example, and you happen to be in Maryland, then it's going to be a different conversation than homelessness in California. The same conversation about the fact that there aren't enough places to stay for most people. And as we have high tech bringing more jobs in our communities, and their ability to pay people substantial wages beyond the minimum wage, then we wind up having a disparity and imbalance in the number of houses and apartments that are available for the haves and the have-nots. So there are more people that can afford housing that may cost $2,500, $3,000, even $4,000 a month for an apartment with one bedroom, one or two bedrooms. And the people that cannot afford that are being forced out of places that they may have lived for 5, 10, 20 years because the rents are going up. There are many people, in fact, a great number of people who are homeless are working every day, but they cannot sustain living and housing and paying for cars and commuting and food. They can't sustain all of that on a minimum wage, especially when they have children. So we have the working poor. That's the challenge we've run into. And when we come back to this nation's distorted morality, it's how did we get here? I remember a couple of decades ago when I don't remember seeing homeless people. In the small town I lived in, outside of New York City, and even in the middle of Manhattan in Brooklyn, there were not homeless people. There were people who might have been drunk, people who were sleeping it off, who slept in doorways, and they were shooed off by the police. There were also drug addicts. So I don't say that there weren't people who wound up in the streets for different reasons. But there were not people, the numbers of people that we have today who are working, making a minimum wage, who were not able to afford living in an apartment, and let alone trying to get a house. You know, that is a dream. You know, it used to be a dream that we have a chicken in every pot and someplace to live. And many, many years ago, everyone could really have a dream of buying a home. It didn't matter where you worked. You could work in a supermarket, you could work in a factory, you could clean houses. But people still had a dream of buying a house. And that dream is being deferred now because the minimum wage is not enough to sustain your ability to get that in many areas. Now, there's some places where the cost of living is really very reasonable. And a lot of seniors, I think, are trying to move to those places because they can't afford to stay in some of the major cities that they may have lived in, raised their children in, gone to school in, worshiped in, but they may have to move to different states and different places in order to live, eat, and entertain themselves on a day-to-day basis. The Poor People's Campaign has come at a very appropriate time. It is calling us to stand up, to have a commitment, national morality. We have the right to ground our public policies and budget allocations in a moral narrative that prioritizes and follows our deepest religious and constitutional moral commitments to justice. There's a lot of words there, but I'd like to take you to public policy. That's what we're talking about. It's not only public policy, but it's the budget. Most of you are familiar with conversations I've had in the past that says it doesn't matter what laws are made, it matters what budgets are funded. And regardless of how the work has been done, how the politician has promoted any laws, any new laws that are brought forth, if the state that you're a part of or the county or the city that you live in does not fund those policies, nothing happens. So the budget allocations is an important process. The next thing, there's a wonderful slide here that looks at public policy and a sense of identity, that a problem can be identified, but at the same time, does anything happen with it? So as we stay with national morality, we're going to look at the moral narrative. So the moral narrative is one that uplifts, that inspires. It's one that encourages people to stay on this road. Stay on this road. There we are. And whether or not you're religious or spiritual or whatever you are, many of the things that are in our Constitution, even though there's separation of church and state, the Constitution was based on moral grounds. And a lot of the ideas that come from the moral grounds are based on some Christian ethos and values. So there's no real separation there, even though we do contend that there's separation of church and state. But our values, our morals, our citizenship, our ideas of how we honor the earth are steeped in spiritual and religious practices. And then there's our Constitution. The Constitution is the written document that specifies how these truths should be implemented in our country. I believe in our Constitution. Many people have not read the Constitution in a while. We have not paid attention to what we believe in. But the Constitution is something I think we should all take time and reread, because it's sometimes quoted in ways that are not complete. I know that happens with the Bible also, where there'll be one, or any book. If you take things out of context, you don't understand the entire meaning of what we're talking about. But our Constitution begins in big letters saying, "We the people." We the people, in order to form a more perfect union. We the people. It's about morality. It's about the total population, and it's inclusive rather than being exclusive. So I'd like for you to consider that as we continue this conversation. I'm going to now be more specific about 40 days of action and help you see what the Poor People's Campaign is focused on. Over the 40 days, that is running from May the 13th till the 23rd of June, the intent is to unite activists to challenge the practices and policies of these 5 areas: racism, poverty, the war economy, ecological devastation, and the nation's distorted morality. What they're going to be doing is going to state capitals. The Poor People's Campaign has state chair people and co-chairs, and they are leading marches to the state capitol. So whether you're in Allentown, Pennsylvania, Albany, New York, the capital in California is Sacramento. That's a pretty big ride from here, but people are riding from the tip of California and San Diego all the way up through to go to Sacramento and be effective in what's going on. During these 40 days, which covers 6 weeks, I'm going to share with you what they're doing. And these are campaigns that are being held. They have chosen 31 states, and they're going to the capitals of 31 states. And we may not hear it in the news because the news has been bombarded with the royal wedding and with what's going on with the North Korean summit, bombarded with the Mueller campaign. But I'd like you to pay attention to what's going on. From May 13th through the 19th, the focus was on child poverty, women, and the disabled. And the theme for that week was Somebody's Hurting Our People. This week, the focus is systemic racism, immigration, and voter suppression. They all are in a similar theme of the mistreatment of people. The week of May 27th through June the 2nd is going to be on the war economy, veterans, education, and gun violence. Now, the idea of gun violence is something that the young people have brought to our attention. Last week, there was another shooting in Texas. Unfortunately, 10 people were affected by that violence. 10 people died, 8 students and 2 teachers. It brings the conversation forward about gun violence. But from May 27th through June 2nd, 2018, there will be people in each of the capitals having that conversation with the legislators and the governor, and whether or not they get to see them or not, they are posting, bringing people, doing marches, having signs, and letting people know they are there and they need the attention. Week 4, June 3rd to the 9th, is focused on ecological devastation and health care. Week 5 is systemic poverty, jobs, income, and housing. And the theme is everybody's got a right to live. And then the final week, June 17th through the 22nd, it's challenging the nation's distorted moral narrative. And the focus is a new and unsettling force. So I encourage you to go to the website. It's www.poorpeoplescampaign.org. You can sign up now. I encourage you to join the campaign each Monday at your state capitol. And at the state capitol, participate. There are several groups of people who are participating. There are those who are taking a stand to march, to carry signs, to be vocal about what they're doing. They're fighting for poverty. They're fighting for justice. They're fighting for education. And while they're there are some people in the group who have said, yes, I am willing to not only march, to not only speak, but I'm willing to take a stand so strong that I'm willing to be arrested. Now, that has to be a certain group. They are being trained specifically in how to do this. The premise of the campaign is nonviolence. I want to repeat, everything around the campaign is nonviolence. So anyone who's going to be a part of it, there's a training in the morning on nonviolence, on how to behave, on how to respond. And if you're not able to follow those guidelines, you're asked to not participate, because this is a nonviolent movement. So you're able to join the campaign every Monday. If you're not able to do that, you can do something. Write a letter to the editor on a policy issue, specifically one associated with that week. If your heart is set on better education, make sure you're writing and letting people know what you demand. If you're concerned about immigration and the way that people are being treated, make sure you pay attention to that. And I'd like to end with a look at what you can do. I'm a person who is pulled by a vision. I have a vision just like Martin Luther King had. And his vision was all in his speech. I have a dream that one day we shall sit side by side, that one day there will be no concern about the color of our skin, that one day each person can walk hand in hand and be held as a citizen, to be honored and treated with dignity and respect. That's my dream. And I encourage you to look at these 5 areas and say, I see something different. So rather than the focus on systemic racism, think about, what do you see? I see all people knowing that they come from the same place, that they're each brought here with something special to do, that there is no racism. We honor each person. We honor who they are. Instead of focusing on poverty, I focus on that there's health, food, and housing for everyone. That the idea of there being poverty is no longer a challenge in our country. We have enough wealth that when shared, everyone can have a place to stay, that there's no more homelessness. When we look at the war economy, my vision is one that peace is more important than war. And that we teach our children, we take the money that instead of building missiles, we build mines. We build up the mind, that the mind is a terrible thing to waste. So we don't try to create wastelands through missiles, but we try to open up minds to new possibilities. From an ecological standpoint, my vision is that our children have trees and animals and water and good air to breathe. That it's up to us to make a difference, that we work with the companies, with the policies, with the state regulations to make sure that our water is drinkable and that these things are sustainable so our children can live, so that our mountains can be climbed, so that our oceans, people can swim in them, and that our fishes have a place to live. And from a place of morality, I envision our country and a world where we look at each one with a sense of dignity and respect. I have a dream. Please have a dream of your own. In the meantime, you're welcome to join me on Sunday, May 27th, at Agape International Spiritual Center, where we'll be exploring this conversation even further from 2:30 to 4 p.m. Thank you so much for listening to my dream. Thank you so much for listening to the conversation about the Poor People's Campaign. They're making a mighty difference. And if it's not on your news, look it up, because what they're doing is for you. Wherever you live, they are standing, they're marching, they're singing, they're praying for the good of you, your children, and your grandchildren. I appreciate you listening. I appreciate you writing notes and letters. How did we get here? I can't tell you how we got here, but I can tell you how we can land someplace else. That is a country, a nation, and a world that understands and honors each person. Peace out.